Well, hello, welcome. My name is Randy Silva. Welcome to my channel. I've been doing various Christian topics series, teachings, and lessons, and the current series is called The Kingdom, and this is part 3. So let's get started. This series is called The Mountain of the Lord's Temple. Last week was a little bit esoteric, maybe is the right word. We expanded on the idea of a model of God that I was talking about in part 8 of the prior series, which was the church. And that model from that part, the church, primarily dealt with the type of God that your model indicates regarding the number of people that will be saved. So how many people you think will be saved throughout time has a great bearing on the type of God that is in your model. Last week we talked about a more complete model that fills in the gaps of big things like how the universe came to be, how the solar system and the earth came to be, how simple life and conscious humans came to be. We also talked about how in the model that has a loving God, that God would communicate to his creation through a book authored by him. And that book would contain stories of when he supernaturally intervened and prophecies about how he would intervene in the future. And that's how that all related and pertained to the idea of the prophecies of the kingdom. So, first of all, let's start with just a word about prophecies that are in the Bible in general. They are written in what I would call enigmatic prose. Sometimes they're written in what's called the apocalyptic style. Although the passage we're going to look at today, you could say it is, but it's not really. If it is anything, it's early apocalyptic style. But that type of style is cryptic and difficult to interpret. And I would say it's intentional. And I would say that it's nearly impossible to interpret prophecies about the future. That is, if you're looking at the Bible, say the book of Revelation, and you're looking at the prophecies and you're saying, okay, I see what's going on here. This is talking about this that's going to happen in the future. That is, you can do that. That's not impossible. But the idea that you'll be certain that that is the case is impossible. What we'll see is that it's very difficult to even talk about prophecies that were given in the past and that their fulfillment was also in the past relative to us. That's difficult. So if that's difficult, imagine trying to interpret a prophecy that hasn't happened yet. When something is in the past, when an event is in the past, then you can match historical aspects of that to the various parts of the prophecy. And the more matching that can be done, the more certain one can be that they are interpreting the prophecy correctly. It's also true that occasionally God or an angel of God will interpret a prophecy that was just given to the prophet. Now, often the interpretation itself is enigmatic, but much less so than the heavily symbolic, heavily poetic prophecy itself. So whenever this happens, when an angel of God or God himself gives a interpretation of this prophecy, then those are prophecies that we really want to dwell on because they're much easier to interpret. The passage that we're going to read today, that's not the case. This also gives a sort of key or cipher for other prophecies for which an interpretation is not given. So when you see this poetic, mysterious symbolism in a prophecy, and then God interprets the prophecy and says in a more matter-of-fact, more plain text way, here's what the various parts mean, then you could see, you kind of get an idea of how God prophesies, how God encodes or encrypts things. And so they act as like a cipher for prophecies that for which there is no interpretation. Here's another thing. Prophecies in the Bible often have two temporally separated fulfillments. I'm not sure why that is, but it's actually very interesting and much more difficult to do on God's part. So what I'm saying is that a prophecy will be given and there will be a near-term fulfillment, still in the future, but in the short term. So maybe in a generation or several generations. But then there can be a much more future, much more distant fulfillment to that same prophecy. That could be 500, 600, 700 years, 2,000 years down the line. And so that's a very interesting aspect to the prophecies that are in the Bible. It seems like those prophecies that have the double meanings tend to be about the Messiah and not about the kingdom. Now, you also find that there are two different types of theologians out there. I don't know if I would say I'm a theologian. I don't have a PhD. I've never gone to a Bible school, so they certainly wouldn't call me a theologian. Depends on how strictly you define the term theologian. But here I'm talking about the more strict definition where people have gone to Bible or school or seminaries and learned about the Bible and history and languages and so forth. And then they go on to use that education to talk about, for instance, prophecies, but talk about other things in the Bible, interpret other things in the Bible. So there are two different types that I've found. I'm sure, there's more than just two, but I'm trying to simplify things. There are those who believe in God and those who do not believe in God. Now, that may be a bit surprising that there are theologians out there that don't believe in God, but they're definitely out there, and they go through the same college courses as the ones who are faithful. In fact, it really becomes a problem when those non-believing theologians, their application is to be a professor themselves. So then now they start to teach the very courses that they had earlier learned, and then they will tend to put a subtle nuance to the lessons with the intent of breaking down, you could call it, quote, the naive faith of their students. And over time, it seems that this is more and more the case, that non-believing professors replace the faithful ones. And I think that's likely because the faithful students, they apply their education to go out into the mission field, start churches, so forth, write books. It seems to be more the case that the non-believing students that get these degrees, they're more academic, and they will tend to stay in that academic arena. So the reason why I bring this up is that you will find theologians that are like this, both believing and non-believing, because again, the believing ones tend to be taught by the non-believing ones, and so they start to think the same way, unfortunately. And so you will find that theologians will question parts of the Bible that would seem to prove its inspiration by God. And that would make sense for the non-believers, because the non-believers, they believe that the Bible is a good story, maybe it has good moral teachings in it, but they don't believe in a God that created the universe. They're more atheistic in that sense. And so when the Bible appears to have some sort of a supernatural aspect to it, then of course they would want to discount that. And prophecies would definitely fall into that category. So if there's some sort of supernatural intervention where God gives knowledge about the future to one of the human authors of the Bible, a prophet, then that would crush non-believing theologians, because that's not possible in the natural world. It's only possible if there's a God and some sort of supernatural intervention. So I found that they have at least one consistent method to work around this problem. The problem that there's prophecies in the Bible that appear to be from God and appear to have, where people were given supernaturally information about the future. That method is to say that this so-called prophecy was actually written at a later time, even after, at or after the event that it claims to prophesy about. So that would mean it's not really a prophecy. It's someone writing about the present, or maybe the past, as if they were well in the past and were getting supernatural information. And that definitely is the case with the passage we'll read today, but even more so the passage that we'll read in the upcoming weeks, which are from Daniel. The passage from today comes from Isaiah, which was written about 750 BC. Sometimes what they will do as well is that since they're saying that this prophecy was actually written at the time of the event, or in the advance of the time of the event, that it wasn't the author who wrote it. It was who claimed to write it. It was someone else writing with that name. Like, for instance, with the book of Isaiah, that depending on which theological model you look at, they say that there are 2 to 4 individuals that wrote the book up to 2 centuries later. Sometimes they divide the book into 4 different parts. They'll refer to it as First Isaiah, Second Isaiah. If you've heard of a podcast called Bema, they hold this belief that that's the case. Now, I will say that it's totally acceptable for one or more writers besides the prophet to actually write down the prophet's words. It's the prophet's words that come from God that are the important supernatural thing. If someone else takes those words and writes them down, then that's totally fine. What's important is that the prophet spoke the words of God during the prophet's lifetime. Okay, so that's just a word about prophecies and about how theologians often look at prophecies. If you do any internet searches about Isaiah or Daniel and how they prophesy about the kingdom of God, you will definitely, top of the list, find things that talk about the things I was just saying, that Daniel didn't actually write it or Isaiah didn't write it. It wasn't actually written 750 BC or 550 BC. It was written in the 2nd century or 4th century or something like that. Let's go ahead and read this week's passage, which is in Isaiah chapter 2. We'll start in verse 1, so 4 verses. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." Okay, so let's break this down. Hopefully you can see how this is in this enigmatic prose. It's not straightforward. It doesn't say, in 523 years, this is what God is going to do. Instead, it says, for instance, it says the last days. Now that's a bit vague, the last days. A lot of times people will read that and think it means the end of time or the end of the earth. But that's I don't believe that's the case in this passage, and it's probably not the case in most passages. The Jews used this term often in the last days, and they used it to refer to the end of an era, like the end of a king's reign, or the end of maybe Jerusalem, or end of northern of Israel. So they used that idiom, and they didn't mean, when the world ends and the Lord comes down from heaven or something like that. They didn't. And this term era, the end of an era, it's the same sense of the word that I used in my first series, which was the era called the era of the Spirit. And as we'll see, there is a relationship between the era of the Spirit and the kingdom. Here, specifically, I believe that the last days is referring to the end of the Mosaic Law, or otherwise known as the Old Covenant. So it's the Old Covenant because it's no longer in effect. It's the one that was superseded by the New Covenant. And so this prophecy then could be referring to that time when the covenant, which is what is right now, the Mosaic Law, would end. And just a small note about these ideas that'll be given to the interpretations, or my interpretations. Here I'll just sort of mention them, but in future episodes, we will tie them all together, make them all make sense. And really, it's the better you can tie something together, the more you can be sure that the interpretation of the prophecy is correct. Okay, so next we see it starts talking about the mountain of the Lord's temple. The mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. What does a mountain have to do with the kingdom? If he had said, God is going to establish a kingdom, and it's going to be the greatest of all the other kingdoms, then that would make, and then maybe it would say, instead of all nations will stream to it, all people will want to be a part of his kingdom. That would be, that would be nice. It would be more direct and less enigmatic. But this is 750 years before. And as we'll see, I think mountain is the same thing as kingdom in this sense. And note that kingdom is a metaphor in and of itself. God says he's going to start a kingdom, but there really isn't a word for the thing that he's going to start. He uses many different metaphors so that we can understand the spiritual thing that he's going to start, that there isn't even a word for. So even kingdom is a metaphor. And here is mountain. It's another metaphor, and it plays off of the characteristics of a mountain, like its majesty and how huge it is, formidable, how immovable. So here it says that God's mountain will be the tallest. In fact, it says in comparison, the other mountains will look like hills. So if mountain is equivalent to kingdom, then what God is saying is that he's going to start a kingdom, and it will be far superior to all the other earthly human kingdoms. Now, this idea of mountain and being associated with God is very well established in the Bible. For instance, in Genesis 22, verse 2, then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show to you." So here's mountain, and it's in the region of Moriah, and this is the story of Abraham and Isaac. Now, a little bit down in verse 14, of course, we know that Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son, but God stopped him. And God went ahead and provided, miraculously, really, a ram. So in verse 14, it says, "So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide," or Jehovah Jireh. And to this day, it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Okay, so in verse 14, that's where God tells Abraham that not only did he directly provide the sacrifice for the moment, this ram caught in a thicket, but that God will provide his own sacrifice. Now, in 2 Chronicles 3:1, we won't turn there, but we'll find that's where, if you read that, you'll see that the temple, Solomon's temple, was built on Mount Moriah. So, in the region of Moriah, the Mount Moriah. So, it's actually very likely that the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son is precisely the place where God later sacrificed his son. And that's because Golgotha was outside the Temple Mount area. I should stop and say that's pretty interesting, don't you think? This whole idea of mountains and Mount Moriah, and even as early as Abraham, God was already prophesying about him starting a temple. And we also talked about how prophecies have two different fulfillment eras. So you have an actual temple that God builds when Solomon builds it, and then it's rebuilt. And then you also have a spiritual kingdom that God builds. So in Exodus 15:17, after crossing the Red Sea in the Song of Moses, the people sing about the future dwelling place of God. It says, you will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, the Lord, your hands established. Another verse that is talking about God creating a temple. There's also the idea of Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai, where Moses meets God and is later given the law, and where he sees the burning bush. So those are all things that happened on mountains. So mountains are a big deal to God. They're used quite a bit physically as physical metaphors of his power and his righteousness, majesty. Okay, so then it says, going back to Isaiah 2, we see it says, and all nations will stream to it. Now, the Jews weren't, as a people, weren't particularly evangelistic. That really wasn't part of their religion. There was a part that says if somebody comes in and wants to convert to Judaism, well, then that's great. Here's what you need to do. But there isn't a part of the kingdom or the law that says you need to go out and find people and then convert them. But the Jews were good at getting exiled and dispersed into surrounding nations. It's a bit of a joke, but that's one of the punishments of not following the law, which they weren't able to follow. Nobody could follow it. And so they would get exiled and dispersed into nations. And then Jews, the males in particular, would have to go to Jerusalem on 3 different occasions in the year. And so this near-term passage could be referring to how this will happen in the future, that Jews that had been dispersed will have to stream from the nations they're in to the nation of Israel at different times. Now, the far-term interpretation would be how Jews would be streaming to Jerusalem, not just for just one of those holiday times, but because the kingdom of God has started, and representatives from the nations of the earth will be there. So at any rate, people who were scattered would say, let's come. And then in the future, all these people would go and they would go up to Jerusalem. Instead of wanting to learn from about the old covenant, the law, they will want to learn about the new covenant. But then it says the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So again, the Jews weren't very evangelistic people. So this is new about this kingdom that God is going to start, is that it won't just stay in Jerusalem. It won't just stay in Zion, which was a mountain in Jerusalem. It will go out from Jerusalem. So then in verse 4, it says, the first part, he will judge between nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So the Israelites were accustomed to having to fight for the promises of God. So, for instance, the promised land, God said, there's the promised land. It's for you guys. You just take it. And they sent some spies, and they were like, there's people there. And there's huge, and the cities have big walls. And 10 of the 12 spies said, we can't do it. And 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, said, no, of course we can do it with God. So the Jews were accustomed to having to fight for these promises. But different here is that God will do the fighting, or God will establish it so that they don't have to fight. And from a near-term perspective, that is also the case, because from this time on, well, in Isaiah, it's the northern part of the kingdom that is exiled, but then soon the southern kingdom, Judea, will also be exiled. And from that time on, they're in and out of oppression, they're always under the some other kingdom. So that would be the near-term interpretation, is that they will worship at the temple basically when they're allowed by the people who are oppressing them. But in the far-term one, God will start a new kingdom, and it won't be established by war. That's how it comes with this idea of he will judge between the nations and settle disputes. If you think of a verse like Galatians 3:28, it says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. So the kingdom has this unifying effect that is different from the old covenant, and how Jerusalem was always oppressed and always at war. And that's really, if you think about this idea of beating your swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, oftentimes it was said the opposite direction, because like when Joshua would say, hey, we're going to go and take this city, they would say, hey, we don't have swords, we don't have spears. He would say, take what you got. Do you have a plowshare? Use that as a sword. Do you have a pruning hook? Use that as a spear. So here it's the other direction. Now you won't need to use your swords. You can use them as plowshares. You won't need to use your spears. You can use them as pruning hooks. And then it kind of restates what it just said, only a little bit clearer. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So you can see how, in summary, you can see how difficult it can be to interpret the prophecy. You might be looking at this, and I look at what I'm saying and go, oh yeah, this makes a ton of sense. Now I'm also looking, incorporating into my thoughts things that we'll look at in the upcoming weeks, and also parts of the New Testament where I believe these prophecies are fulfilled. So in my mind, I have all those things put together. If you are looking at what I'm saying going, how did you get that out of this passage? I understand. I understand how you would think that. And that's fine that you think that. I would say just sort of table these ideas from Isaiah chapter 2 and table from Daniel, as we'll look at in the upcoming weeks. Do your best to table them and then be able to assemble them all together, and you'll see that they all form this tapestry that all paints a picture of the kingdom of God. So thanks again for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see everybody next week, Sunday at 5 p.m. Thanks again.